England, June 5, 1944. The air hangs heavy with fog and anticipation. In a military camp tucked away in the English countryside, American paratroopers prepare for what will become the largest seaborne invasion in history. Private James Miller folds a worn photograph of his family and tucks it into his breast pocket, right next to his heart. Across the barracks, Sergeant Frank Davis methodically checks his equipment, each click and snap a ritual that grounds him in the present, while his mind drifts to the uncertain future. Outside, Lieutenant Thomas Wilson briefs his men with steady words that mask his own doubts. These are not just soldiers. They are fathers, sons, and brothers about to leap into darkness. Will they find the courage to jump when that green light finally comes on? The brass compass gleamed in Lieutenant Wilson's palm, its needle quivering slightly before settling north. His father had carried it through the muddy trenches of the Argonne Forest in the previous war. "Same enemy, different battlefield," Wilson whispered, closing his fingers around the tarnished brass. Dawn broke over the English countryside as the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne stirred in their barracks. The routine was well established after months of training. Up at 0500, beds made with military precision, personal grooming completed in under 10 minutes. The regiment had transformed farm fields into a makeshift American town, complete with mess halls, supply depots, and training grounds. "Rise and shine, Miller. Your mama ain't here to tuck you in," Sergeant Davis barked, yanking the blanket from the young private's cot. Miller groaned but was on his feet instantly. At 22, he was among the younger men in the unit, farm strong, with a shock of wheat-blonde hair and freckles that earned him the nickname Farm Boy. "Been up half the night already, Sarge," Miller replied, reaching for his boots. "Johnson talks in his sleep. All about some girl named Betty," Davis grunted. "Better than Williams. Sounds like a buzzsaw cutting through oak." Across the barracks, Corporal Martinez performed his daily ritual, arranging a small photo of the Virgin Mary beside his shaving kit. His fingers moved in a practiced sign of the cross before he began trimming his mustache with meticulous precision. Outside, the morning air carried the smell of diesel fumes, cigarette smoke, and the distinct aroma of powdered eggs from the mess tent. Men gathered in small clusters, some practicing equipment checks, others reviewing maps or playing cards. The camp buzzed with activity but lacked the usual banter and horsing around. Lieutenant Wilson made his rounds, compass tucked safely in his breast pocket. He nodded to Technical Sergeant Cooper, a former mechanic from Detroit who could fix anything with an engine. "Weather report, sir?" Cooper asked, eyes squinting skyward. "Low clouds, some fog, nothing's changed," Wilson replied, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. In the communications tent, radio operators maintained contact with headquarters, their voices a monotone of military precision. Private Simmons, a former telegraph operator from Chicago, had ears that could pick out signals through the worst static. He'd been monitoring German frequencies for days, though most of what they intercepted was heavily coded. Near the edge of camp, the medical station was prepped and ready. Doc Winters, who'd been a country physician in Vermont before the war, had arranged his supplies with the same care he once showed for his small-town practice. He'd seen what happened to men who jumped into combat: the broken ankles, the dislocated shoulders, the wounds that couldn't wait for proper field hospitals. "Check your sulfur packets twice," he reminded every soldier who passed by. "And for God's sake, don't lose your morphine." The mess tent offered the usual fare: powdered eggs, spam, coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon. But today, the cooks had managed real bacon, a luxury that drew appreciative nods. "Might be the last decent meal for a while," Captain Reynolds remarked, sliding his tray next to Wilson's. As company commander, Reynolds carried himself with the confidence of a career soldier, though Wilson knew the captain had been a history teacher in civilian life. "The men look ready," Wilson offered. Reynolds nodded slowly. "As ready as anyone can be." He lowered his voice. "Intelligence reports German 91st Division is in our drop zone. Heavier resistance than we planned for." Wilson's hand moved unconsciously to the compass in his pocket. "They'll adapt. We've trained for worse. Back at the barracks, Private Miller finished a letter home, careful to exclude anything that might concern the censors or his mother. He described the English countryside, the strange warm beer, and how he'd picked up enough French to maybe impress a girl or two. Nothing about what waited across the channel. As afternoon approached, the regimental commander called the officers for a briefing. Lieutenant Wilson tucked his compass away and straightened his uniform. The weight of command settled on his shoulders as he made his way to headquarters, passing men cleaning weapons, checking equipment, or simply sitting in silence. Tomorrow, these fields would be empty. Tonight, final preparations would begin. The invasion that had existed only on paper and in briefings was about to become terribly real. The half-written letter lay on Sergeant Davis's footlocker, the pencil resting across words that had taken him hours to compose. "Dearest Ellen, if you're reading this, then I've done my duty as best I could." He'd stopped there, unsure how to continue. "What do you say to a woman who might be reading your final words?" Davis folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. He'd finish it tonight, after the briefing. Maybe the right words would come then. "Got a photo, farm boy?" Davis asked, noticing Miller staring at his own letter. Miller nodded, pulling out a worn photograph. "My folks, my sister Ruth and our dog Rust." The black and white image showed a sturdy Midwestern family standing proudly in front of a white farmhouse. "Iowa, right, Nebraska, corn and wheat mainly. Dad wanted me to take over the farm someday." Miller shrugged. "Never thought I'd see England, that's for sure." Davis nodded. Before the war, he'd managed a hardware store in Pennsylvania. He'd been older than most when he enlisted at 28, leaving behind Ellen and their 2 young daughters. The letter in his pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Across the barracks, Corporal Martinez was showing Lieutenant Wilson photos of his restaurant in New Mexico. "Best chile rellenos north of the border," he boasted. "My mother taught me the recipe. We'll all go there after the war. First meal's on me." Wilson smiled. He rarely shared his own past, the law degree from Yale, the family banking business in Boston, the engagement he'd broken off to enlist. The men knew him only as their platoon leader, and he preferred it that way. "What about you, Coop?" Miller called to the technical sergeant who was methodically disassembling and cleaning his jump knife. "Detroit," Cooper grunted. "Worked the line at Ford before all this. Good with engines, not much for talking." Yet everyone knew Cooper had volunteered for the Paratroopers after his brother died at Pearl Harbor. Doc Winters sat nearby, writing his own letter, his handwriting precise and measured, like everything else about him. "Had my own practice in Vermont," he offered without looking up. "Small-town medicine, delivered half the babies in the county." He paused. "Taught me that coming into this world is just as precarious as going out." Private Simmons, the radio operator, broke the momentary silence. Used to work the telegraph for Western Union in Chicago. Heard all kinds of messages coming through. His fingers tapped unconsciously on his knee. Morse code for letters only he could hear. Figured the army could use someone who knows how to listen. The conversation drifted from hometowns to first jobs, favorite baseball teams, and best fishing spots. Normal talk that anchored them to a world that seemed increasingly distant as the hours ticked by. "My old man fought in the last one," Private Williams offered. "Never talked about it much, but made damn sure I knew how to shoot before I enlisted." Davis nodded. His father hadn't fought. Too old for the Great War, too settled with family for this one. He wondered what Ellen was telling their daughters about where he was, what he was doing. In his last letter home, he'd written about the English countryside, the strange foods, the endless training. Nothing about fear, nothing about the nightmares that sometimes woke him. "Anyone here married?" Martinez asked, though most knew each other's stories by now. Several hands went up. Davis, Cooper, Winters, and a few others. Lieutenant Wilson kept his hands folded on his lap, thoughts turning briefly to Catherine and the engagement ring she'd returned. "Got a girl waiting, Lieutenant?" Miller asked. unusually bold with his commanding officer. Wilson's smile was tight. Just my mother and the family dog. The lie came easily after months of practice. As evening approached, the men drifted to their own tasks, some writing letters like Davis, others cleaning equipment or simply lying on their bunks, staring at nothing. Conversations became quieter, more reflective. Tomorrow loomed large in every mind. Davis pulled out his letter again, pencil poised. The words still wouldn't come. How do you tell someone that every moment with them had mattered? That you regret the arguments over small things? That you hope your daughters remember you if you don't come home? He wrote simply, I love you more than I ever said. Tell the girls stories about me. Then he folded the unfinished letter again. Perhaps there was nothing more to say after all. The map spread across the wooden table showed the Norman coastline in stark detail, beaches labeled with code names, defensive positions marked in red, and inland terrain rendered in precise contours. But most important were the marked drop zones, designated areas scattered behind enemy lines where the paratroopers would land in darkness. Lieutenant Wilson stared at these outline zones, memorizing every feature, every road, every potential rallying point. Gentlemen, this is Operation Neptune, Colonel Braddock announced to the assembled officers in the command tent, the airborne component of Operation Overlord. Captain Reynolds moved his finger along the coastline. The 4th Infantry Division will hit Utah Beach at H-hour. Our job is to secure the western flank by dropping behind enemy lines here, here, and here. His finger tapped 3 locations marked as DZ, 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 D. We drop at 0100, 5 hours before the beach landings. Lieutenant Wilson noted, committing the time to memory. Exactly, Braddock confirmed. You'll be scattered across these areas with specific objectives. He gestured to an aide who distributed sealed envelopes to each officer. These contain your unit's specific missions. Memorize them, then destroy the papers. Wilson opened his envelope. Secure and hold the Lafayette Causeway and bridge over the Murder River until relieved. Prevent German reinforcements from reaching Utah Beach. Braddock continued. Intelligence estimates approximately 6,000 German troops in the area, primarily from the 91st Air Landing Division and elements of the 709th Static Infantry Division. Defenses? Someone asked. Extensive, Reynolds replied grimly. Flooded fields here and here, anti-aircraft batteries throughout. Machine gun nests covering likely assembly points. Wilson noted the areas of flooding, deliberate inundation by the Germans to complicate any airborne operation. The fields where they might land could be under several feet of water. Back at the barracks, Wilson gathered his platoon. Miller, Davis, Martinez, Cooper, Simmons, Williams. Faces now turned to him expectantly. He couldn't show the actual map, but he'd sketched key features from memory. We're jumping into Normandy, he stated simply, watching the information register on each face. Some nodded, others remained impassive. They'd all suspected as much. Our objective is this causeway, Wilson continued, pointing to his sketch. It's critical that German reinforcements don't reach the beaches. We hold until relieved by forces moving inland from Utah Beach. How long, sir? Davis asked. Unknown. Could be hours, could be days. Opposition? This from Cooper. Always practical. Varied. Likely elements of the night, well-equipped, well-trained. The fields around our drop zone have been flooded, so expect wet landings. The men absorbed this information silently. They'd trained for water landings, but darkness, flooding, and enemy fire would complicate everything. Questions? Wilson prompted. Miller raised his hand. Rally point, sir? Primary is the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église. If separated, make your way there. Secondary points are marked here and here. Wilson indicated on his sketch. Identification challenges flash, responses thunder. Anyone who doesn't know the response is considered enemy until proven otherwise. Simmons, the radio operator, asked about communications. Wilson explained the radio frequencies. backup channels, and code words they'd use to coordinate with other units and call for support if needed. Martinez had a different concern. "Civilians, sir? Evacuation orders were issued, but expect some to remain. They're to be treated as neutrals unless they prove hostile. Our priority is the mission, not liberation. That comes later." Wilson outlined the equipment they'd carry, each man jumping with approximately 90 pounds, including weapon, ammunition, explosives, rations, medical supplies, and personal items. The weight was enormous, especially for smaller men like Simmons. "We'll also carry these." Wilson held up a metal cricket toy. "1 click is the challenge, 2 clicks is the response. Use it to find each other in the dark." As the briefing continued, Wilson noted each man's reaction. Davis was stone-faced but attentive, clearly thinking through tactical implications. Cooper nodded occasionally, probably already planning equipment modifications. Inola looked nervous but determined, while Martinez seemed to be visualizing the terrain as Wilson described it. "Watches synchronized at 1800 tomorrow," Wilson concluded. "Final equipment check at 1900. Transport to airfield at 2000. Estimated takeoff." He paused, looking at each man directly. "Any other questions?" The silence that followed held the weight of understanding. Tomorrow night, they would jump into history, carrying nothing but what was on their backs and the training that had prepared them for this moment. "Get some sleep," Wilson said finally. "Tomorrow will be the longest day of your lives." The metal cricket clicker made a distinctive snap-crackle sound when Private Miller pressed it between his thumb and forefinger. 1 click, pause, 2 clicks back. The response that would identify friend from foe in the darkness of Normandy. "Don't lose this," Sergeant Davis warned, distributing the small metal toys to each man. "In the dark, this might be the only thing keeping you from getting shot by your own side." The supply tent bustled with activity as paratroopers meticulously prepared their equipment. 90 pounds of gear would accompany each man on the jump, an extraordinary burden that could mean life or death once they hit the ground. "Check your main chute, check your reserve, then have your buddy check both again," Davis instructed as men laid out their parachutes on long tables. Miller inspected his T5 parachute, running his fingers along the cord lines, checking for any frays or tangles. The white silk billowed slightly under his careful handling. Corporal Martinez worked opposite him, their eyes meeting occasionally with unspoken understanding. Each man's life depended on the other's attention to detail. "Remember," Lieutenant Wilson said, moving between the tables, "your reserve chute goes on your chest, main chute on your back. If something goes wrong with the main, you need to be able to deploy your reserve immediately." The cricket clickers were officially called life preservers by the supply officers, though most men recognized them as children's toys repurposed for war. Small, reliable, and with a distinctive sound unlike anything in nature, they were perfect for nighttime identification. At the weapons station, Technical Sergeant Cooper supervised the cleaning and preparation of the M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M1A1 carbines that would arm the unit. Each weapon was disassembled, cleaned thoroughly, then reassembled and function checked. "No jams, no misfires," Cooper insisted. "Your weapon is your life." Private Simmons carefully packed his radio equipment, including spare batteries and antenna parts. As the unit's communications specialist, he carried an additional 20 pounds beyond what other men bore. "If this gets damaged in the jump, we're cut off," he murmured, wrapping the radio components in extra padding before securing them in his pack. Doc Winters arranged his medical supplies with clinical precision: sulfur packets, morphine syrets, battle dressings, tourniquets, each item carefully organized for quick access in the chaos that would surely follow their landing. 2 sulfur packets and 1 morphine syret for each man, he reminded them as he moved through the tent. "Know where they are at all times. You might need to use them on yourself." Lieutenant Wilson inspected his own equipment, paying particular attention to the maps and compass that would guide them to their objectives. He'd waterproofed the maps with paraffin, knowing that the flooded fields of Normandy would test every precaution. "Sir," Davis approached, voice lowered. "Some of the men are concerned about the extra demolition charges." Wilson nodded. Each man would carry 8 pounds of Composition B explosives, necessary for their mission to secure bridges and crossroads. But dangerous additional weight for the jump. "Tell them it's non-negotiable. We'll need every pound to complete our objectives." Meanwhile, the riggers, specialists responsible for packing parachutes, worked with methodical care. Every chute was signed off by the packer, a personal guarantee of quality. No one would cut corners when lives depended on their work. Miller attached his jump knife to his lower leg, ensuring it was secure but accessible. The knife could save his life if he landed in trees or if his parachute lines became tangled. "Cricket check," Davis called out suddenly, and the tent filled with clicking sounds as men tested their identification devices. Click, 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 click. The simple sound that would become crucial in the confusion of night combat. The specialized equipment continued to pile up. Entrenching tools, wire cutters, grenades, rations, canteens, ammunition, first aid kits, gas masks. Each item essential, each adding weight that could drag a man down into flooded fields or slow his movement under fire. "Remember your escape kits," Wilson reminded them, holding up a small package containing silk maps, a compass and French currency. "If you're separated or captured, these might be your ticket home." As evening approached, the men began assembling their final loads, helping each other adjust harnesses and balance the weight. The cricket clickers disappeared into secured pockets, ready for retrieval after landing. Cooper approached Lieutenant Wilson with a modified trigger assembly for his carbine. "Smoother action, sir. Less likely to jam if it gets wet." Wilson nodded his thanks, noting how each man contributed his particular expertise. Cooper with mechanical skills, Simmons with communications knowledge, Winters with medical expertise. Together they formed a unit greater than the sum of its parts. "Gear inspection at 1900, Wilson announced. "Nothing extraneous, nothing missing." The weight they would carry into battle wasn't just physical. Each piece of equipment represented responsibility, preparation, and the slim margin between success and failure that would define their mission. The pencil hesitated above the V-mail form as Private Miller considered what to write. These government-issued sheets would be photographed, miniaturized onto microfilm, and shipped home, saving valuable cargo space while connecting soldiers with their loved ones. But tonight, the knowledge that censors would read every word made the task more difficult than usual. "Dear Mom and Dad," he began, the familiar greeting somehow inadequate for what might be his final letter home. Across the barracks, dozens of men hunched over identical forms, each facing the same challenge: what to say when you can't say what matters most. "Stuck?" Sergeant Davis asked, noticing Miller's prolonged pause. "Just trying to find the right words," Miller replied. "Can't say where we're going, what we're doing. Feels like I'm writing around everything important." Davis nodded, understanding. "Tell them about the weather, the food, the guys in the unit. That's what they really want to know anyway, that you're okay." Miller nodded and continued writing. "The English summer is nothing like Nebraska. More rain and everything so green. The locals have been kind to us, though their food takes some getting used to. Yesterday I had something called black pudding, which isn't pudding at all, but some kind of sausage made with blood. Can you imagine serving that at the Sunday table?" He deliberately kept his tone light, knowing his mother would read between the lines for his emotional state. Better to sound cheerful than let her worry more than she already would. Lieutenant Wilson finished his letter quickly, a brief note to his parents, mentioning books he'd read and thanking them for a recent package. Nothing about tomorrow, nothing about his responsibilities or fears. They expected such reserve from him. Corporal Martinez wrote 2 letters, one in English to his wife, another in Spanish to his parents. The latter would receive extra scrutiny from censors suspicious of foreign languages, so he kept it simple, focusing on family matters and avoiding anything that might be misconstrued. Private Simmons wrote to his girlfriend in Chicago, carefully avoiding phrases like "when I come home" or "after the war." Such optimism seemed dangerous on the eve of combat. Instead, he told her about a dance he'd attended in the nearby village and how none of the English girls could jitterbug properly. Technical Sergeant Cooper wrote no letters. His parents were gone, and he had no wife or steady girlfriend. Instead, he spent the time meticulously checking his gear, occasionally glancing at the others with their pencils and paper. Doc Winters wrote to his medical practice partner, including detailed instructions for patients with ongoing conditions. Miss Hargrove's hypertension will need monitoring monthly, he noted, as if expecting to be away for only a short while, rather than facing the unknown. Miller continued his letter, filling the small space with anecdotes about his unit without naming anyone specifically. Censors would black out names and identifying details. He mentioned training exercises in vague terms, the countryside, even the stray dog that had adopted their company for a few weeks. What he couldn't write was what preoccupied his thoughts. "We're jumping into France tomorrow night. I'm scared but trying not to show it. If something happens to me, please know I died doing something important." "Mail collection in 5 minutes," called the company clerk, moving between the rows of bunks. Miller hastily finished his letter. "I'm doing well and thinking of you all every day. Please don't worry too much. Give Rusty a scratch behind the ears for me. I miss his snoring at the foot of my bed. All my love, James." He sealed the envelope and handed it to the clerk, knowing that military censors would review every word before it was photographed and sent home. Certain phrases, locations, or details would be blacked out with heavy ink, a visible reminder of war's necessities. Sergeant Davis finally completed his letter to Ellen, having rewritten it several times. The original draft, with its heavy emotional content, remained in his pocket. This official version was more restrained, though he'd included drawings for his daughters and a pressed wildflower from the English countryside. As the clerk moved on, conversation in the barracks remained subdued. The act of writing home had forced each man to contemplate what lay ahead, and what he might be leaving behind forever. Lieutenant Wilson observed his men, noting their expressions as they handed over their letters. Some seemed relieved, others pensive. These might be their last communications home, and everyone in the room understood this unspoken reality. "Mails collected," the clerk announced, departing with the stack of V-mail forms, each one carrying words that danced around the truth of tomorrow's mission. Miller looked at the small blank space where his letter had been. Everything he'd wanted to say remained unwritten, but perhaps his parents would understand anyway. Parents often did. The small khaki-covered New Testament fit perfectly in the breast pocket of Private Miller's uniform, issued by the Army to all soldiers who wanted one. The book's simple cover bore the words, "May this keep you safe from harm." Inside the front cover, President Roosevelt had written a message to the troops, though Miller knew the words by heart without looking. "As Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve." The makeshift chapel was actually a large tent with wooden benches arranged in rows. At the front, 3 chaplains, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, took turns leading services throughout the day. Now, as evening approached, men filtered in regardless of their usual religious affiliation. Fear and mortality made believers of many. "Never seen you at services before," Sergeant Davis remarked, as Lieutenant Wilson slid onto the bench beside him. "Seemed like a good day to attend," Wilson replied quietly. The Protestant chaplain, Captain Reynolds, stood before them in combat uniform, with only his cross insignia indicating his role. "Let us pray," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed text. Miller held his New Testament tightly, the familiar words of the 23rd Psalm washing over him. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Corporal Martinez had already attended Catholic Mass earlier, taking communion and confession with Father Donovan, but returned now for this general service. His own prayer book rested beside the photograph of the Virgin Mary, among his personal effects. Technical Sergeant Cooper sat stoically, neither participating nor dismissive. When questioned about his beliefs, he usually replied simply, "I believe in being prepared." Yet he sat respectfully as the chaplain spoke of courage, duty, and sacrifice. Doc Winters, raised Presbyterian but now describing himself as practically minded, nevertheless found comfort in the rituals. The chaplain's words about service to others resonated with his medical training and personal ethics. Private Simmons, who had rarely mentioned religion during their months of training, now clutched a worn Bible that had been his grandmother's. The faded inscription inside read, "To my Harold, may God's word light your path." After prayers and a short sermon about facing fear with faith, the chaplain invited men to come forward for individual blessings or counsel. A long line formed quickly. Lieutenant Wilson observed his men, noting who sought this final spiritual comfort and who remained seated. He didn't judge either choice. Every man faced death in his own way. Private Williams approached the Jewish chaplain, Rabbi Feldman, in a corner of the tent. Though not Jewish himself, Williams had developed a friendship with the rabbi during training. Their quiet conversation ended with Feldman pressing something into Williams's hand, a small stone from Jerusalem. The rabbi explained. Outside the tent, some men gathered in small groups, unwilling to participate in organized services, but finding their own forms of spiritual preparation. 3 black soldiers from another company stood in a circle, heads bowed, voices raised in a quiet spiritual that spoke of crossing rivers and finding freedom. Miller approached Davis after the service, his New Testament still in hand. "My mother would be happy to see me here," he admitted. "Always worried I didn't take church seriously enough." Davis nodded. "My girls are baptized. Ellen makes sure they attend Sunday school." He paused. "Funny how you think about these things now. Do you think it helps?" Miller asked, his voice lowered. "Praying, I mean." "Can't hurt," Davis replied pragmatically. "Besides, gives you something to focus on besides your own thoughts." Lieutenant Wilson overheard their conversation, but said nothing, his hand unconsciously touching his breast pocket where his father's compass resided. Different men, different talismans, compass, Bible, medal, photograph, each providing some sense of connection and protection. As darkness began to fall, the chaplains moved among the men, offering brief words of encouragement or simply a hand on the shoulder. Father Donovan administered last rites to those who requested it, though he called it special blessing to avoid unsettling others. Captain Reynolds, the Protestant chaplain, approached Lieutenant Wilson. "Your men seem prepared," he observed. "As well as possible," Wilson acknowledged. "I'll be jumping with Baker Company," Reynolds said. "Perhaps we'll meet on the other side." Wilson nodded, appreciating the dual meaning. "Perhaps we will." The religious services concluded. As the sun set, each man carrying away whatever comfort or courage he had found. Miller carefully tucked his New Testament into his left breast pocket, opposite the photograph of his family on the right, faith and love flanking his heart as he faced what lay ahead. Doc Winters, leaving the tent, summarized the feeling of many. "Faith is fine, but keep your powder dry too." The men around him chuckled, tension momentarily broken by the old military adage. In the gathering dusk, the camp grew quieter as men turned inward with their thoughts, prayers and anted rituals. Tomorrow would come regardless of preparation, spiritual or otherwise. The chocolate bar from the K-ration pack remained unopened in Private Miller's hand, a dark, firm rectangle wrapped in brown paper and tin foil. Unlike the rest of his rations, this wasn't for eating, not yet. Soldiers were superstitious about such things. Some saved cigarettes, others a can of fruit. Miller saved his chocolate. "Good luck charm?" Sergeant Davis asked, noticing Miller slip the bar into his pocket. "Something like that," Miller replied. "Figured I'd save it for when we're on the ground. Something to look forward to." The mess tent was unusually crowded as the paratroopers gathered for what many silently acknowledged might be their last proper meal. The cooks had outdone themselves: real eggs instead of powdered, fresh bread, and even ice cream for dessert. The army understood the psychological importance of sending men into battle well-fed. Lieutenant Wilson moved between tables, stopping briefly to share a word with each group. Not eating himself, just ensuring his men were taken care of, a small gesture of leadership that didn't go unnoticed. "You should eat something, sir," Davis suggested when Wilson reached their table. "Later," Wilson replied, though both men knew that later was filled with too many uncertainties to count on. The table talk shifted between forced casualness and practical matters. Technical Sergeant Cooper explained again how to disassemble an M1 Gar end if it got wet or muddy during the landing. Doc Winters reminded everyone about using sulfur powder immediately on any open wound. Corporal Martinez described the best technique for landing in trees should their chutes get caught. "Food's better than usual," Private Simmons remarked, scraping his plate clean. "Think they're buttering us up before the big dance." "Condemned man's last meal," Williams joked darkly, earning a sharp look from Davis. "Talk like that doesn't help," Davis said firmly. His own plate was barely touched, appetite diminished by responsibility and the half-finished letter in his pocket. Miller ate methodically, focusing on each bite, as if it deserved special attention. The chocolate bar in his pocket was a promise to himself that he would survive to enjoy it in France. Across the mess tent, other companies engaged in their own rituals. Some groups were rowdy, using humor and bravado to mask anxiety. Others ate in near silence, each man lost in private thoughts. A few officers studied maps between bites, still planning, still preparing. "My mother's cooking puts this to shame," Martinez said, breaking a momentary silence at their table. "After the war, you should all come to New Mexico. She'll make chile rellenos that'll change your life." The invitation hung in the air, a gesture of friendship and an act of optimism. If there was an after, if they all made it. "I'll take you up on that," Miller replied with deliberate certainty. "Never had Mexican food in Nebraska." "Then you've never really lived," Martinez grinned, the conversation achieving its purpose, pulling them back from dark thoughts to simple camaraderie. Lieutenant Wilson finally sat down with a cup of coffee. No food. His compass lay on the table beside the cup, a habit he'd developed during training, always knowing where north was, always oriented. "Any word on the weather, sir?" Cooper asked. "Practical as always, holding steady," Wilson replied. "Some clouds, chance of scattered rain." Everyone understood the implication. The jump was still on. Doc Winters joined them, carrying an extra serving of ice cream. "Might as well indulge," he commented. "Sugar's good for energy anyway." The conversation drifted to hometowns and favorite meals. Davis described his wife's Sunday pot roast. Miller talked about fresh corn on his family's farm. Cooper admitted a weakness for his mother's apple pie. Normal conversation that served as a tether to the world they'd left behind and hoped to return to. As men finished eating, some lingered over coffee while others drifted out to attend to final preparations. Lieutenant Wilson checked his watch. 18, just over 4 hours until they would board the transport trucks to the airfield. Miller patted his pocket, feeling the chocolate bar inside. A small promise, a small hope. Something normal and sweet, waiting on the other side of what was to come. "Save room for dinner tomorrow," Davis said, as they prepared to leave the mess tent. French cuisine. The attempt at normalcy, at projecting past the danger that waited, wasn't lost on the men. Outside, the evening sky remained stubbornly bright with early June sunlight, hours yet before darkness would fall, before planes would lift into the night, carrying them toward history. The chocolate bar in Miller's pocket would make the journey with him, unopened, until victory or never opened at all. Lieutenant Wilson gathered his platoon leaders for a final review of signals and rally points. The mess tent emptied gradually, The special meal concluded. In the kitchen, cooks already prepared combat rations that would travel with each man, preserved food for the days ahead when hot meals would be impossible. The chocolate bar, standard in every K ration, was meant for quick energy in the field, but for Miller and many others, it represented something more. A small pleasure, delayed, a reason to survive the night, a taste of normalcy to be reclaimed on the other side of danger. The small tin of face paint contained just two colors, olive drab and black. Private Miller scooped a fingertip of each, mixing them on the back of his hand before applying the dark paste to his face. The mirror reflected a stranger back at him, cheekbones accentuated by shadow, forehead darkened, the familiar contours of his face transformed into something primitive and dangerous. "Not bad, farm boy," Sergeant Davis commented, his own face already striped with careful application. "But you need more under the eyes. Moonlight reflects off skin there." Around the barracks, men assisted one another with the ritual of applying combat face paint, turning familiar faces into masked warriors. The transformation was more than physical. Each stroke seemed to distance them from their civilian identities, preparing them psychologically for what lay ahead. Lieutenant Wilson moved between his men, checking their progress. His own face was already painted, a restrained pattern that darkened his features without the elaborate designs some men preferred. "Remember, this isn't about looking frightening," he reminded them. "It's about not being seen." Corporal Martinez helped Miller darken the areas Davis had indicated. "My grandfather was Pueblo," he explained as he worked. "He said warriors painted their faces to become something else during battle, not just for hiding, but for strength." Miller nodded, feeling the subtle weight of the paint on his skin. "My grandfather fought in the last war. Said they used burnt cork back then, when they had to go on night patrol." The face paint was a recent innovation for American paratroopers, a lesson learned from earlier operations where pale faces had been visible to enemy forces at night. Now it was standard procedure, part of the final transformation from men to warrior. Technical Sergeant Cooper applied his paint methodically, using the mirror to ensure complete coverage with minimal waste. His face became a dark mask, with just his eyes visible, cold and focused. No one would mistake him for anything but what he was tonight, a weapon pointed at the enemy. Private Simmons struggled with his application, his hands slightly shaking from the tension of the approaching mission. "Here, let me," offered Doc Winters, taking the tin and applying the paint with the same precise movements he used when treating patients. "Close your eyes," he instructed, and Simmons complied with the trust of a child. The face paint ritual created a strange intimacy in the barracks. Men who had trained together for months now touched each other's faces, ensuring no skin remained visible that might reflect moonlight or flares. The normal boundaries of personal space dissolved in this final preparation. "Indians used to do this before going into battle," Private Williams commented, applying stripes that extended from his temples down his cheeks. "Different purpose," Lieutenant Wilson corrected mildly. "Their war paint was meant to be seen to identify tribes and accomplish warriors. Ours is meant to make us invisible. Yet the psychological effect seems similar. As each man's familiar features disappeared beneath the dark paint, something else emerged, a warrior identity distinct from the farmers, students and shopkeepers they had been in civilian life. "Feels different," Miller admitted quietly to Davis as they finished. "Like putting on a mask for a role." Davis nodded understanding. "Because that's exactly what it is. Tonight we're not ourselves. We're instruments of the mission." The transformation continued beyond their faces. Hands were darkened to prevent telltale flashes of skin during movement. Any metal surfaces on equipment that might reflect light had been dulled with paint or tape. Boots had been treated with waterproofing grease that further darkened their appearance. Outside the barracks, the evening light was fading. Soon full darkness would envelop the camp, matching the darkness they had applied to their faces. The painted men moved differently now, more carefully, more deliberately, as if their altered appearance had already shifted them into combat mindset. Lieutenant Wilson gathered his platoon, their darkened faces making identification more challenging. He relied on body shapes, movements, and voices to distinguish his men. "Final equipment check-in 30 minutes, he announced. "Full combat load." Miller caught his reflection one more time in the mirror. The face that stared back belonged to a stranger, a soldier ready for war, not a Nebraska farm boy. The paint would remain until the mission was complete, a constant reminder of the transformation from civilian to warrior, from individual to instrument. "Do I look scary?" he asked Martinez, with a forced grin that revealed white teeth against his darkened face. "You look like what you are," Martinez replied seriously. "A shadow, a ghost, something that moves in darkness and vanishes before it can be seen." As the men completed their preparations, conversation diminished. The face paint seemed to demand a different kind of behavior, more contained, more focused. Even habitual jokers like Williams became subdued, affected by the ritual transformation. Davis looked at his assembled squad, their familiar faces now dark masks, with eyes that reflected purpose and tension. "We look ready," he said simply to Lieutenant Wilson. Wilson nodded agreement. The painted faces of his men represented the final step in their preparation, no longer individuals with personal concerns, but components of a mission, instruments of history about to be written in darkness and danger. The metal dog tags hung around Private Miller's neck, cool against his skin despite the warm evening. Two identical discs, stamped with essential information: Miller James, A430 Chevy and Fiat, Ts20, his name, serial number, blood type, tetanus immunization date, religion, the sum of his identity reduced to a few stamped letters and numbers on metal that wouldn't burn. "Make sure they're separated," Sergeant Davis reminded the men as they began donning their combat gear. "One stays with your body, the other goes to records." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The barracks had transformed into organized chaos as paratroopers assembled their equipment in precise order. Each man would jump with nearly 90 pounds of gear, an enormous burden for the drop, but essential for survival and combat effectiveness once on the ground. "Start with your base layer," Lieutenant Wilson instructed. "Work outward methodically. Have your jump buddy check each stage." Miller and Martinez partnered up, each inspecting the other's progress. First came the standard olive-drab uniform, reinforced at elbows and knees. Then the jump boots, painstakingly laced and double-knotted. The boots had been broken in over months of training, molded to each man's feet through miles of marching. "Dog tags, secure?" Martinez asked, and Miller nodded, tucking the metal discs beneath his undershirt where they wouldn't jingle during movement. Next came the parachute harness, a complex web of straps that distributed the opening shock across the body. The men helped each other adjust the fit, ensuring it was tight enough to prevent slipping, but not so tight it would restrict blood flow during the long flight. Technical Sergeant Cooper moved among them, his experienced eye catching potential problems. "Tighten that strap, Williams. And check your quick release. It's not seated properly." Doc Winters had modified his combat load to accommodate additional medical supplies. His aid bag contained plasma, additional morphine syrettes, and specialized bandages for chest wounds, reflecting the grim expectations of what awaited them. "Your first aid kit secured?" he asked each man he passed. "Remember sulfur powder immediately on any open wound. Don't wait." Private Simmons struggled under the weight of his radio equipment, an additional 20 pounds beyond what others carried. Cooper wordlessly helped redistribute some items, balancing the load more effectively across Simmons's frame. The men continued layering equipment methodically. Ammunition pouches containing 8 fully loaded magazines for each M1 Garand. Grenades secured in specialized pockets. Canteens filled with water. K rations for 3 days, entrenching tools, gas masks, maps in waterproof cases, spare socks, the weight accumulated with each addition, dog tags showing. Davis asked sharply when he noticed a glint of metal at Williams's collar. "No, Sergeant," Williams responded, quickly tucking the tags back under his shirt. In the darkness of the drop zone, any reflection could draw enemy fire. Lieutenant Wilson checked his own equipment, his movements precise and economical. His officer's gear included a compass, detailed maps, and a signaling mirror, tools of command that would help him gather and direct his scattered men after the drop. "Main chute next," Wilson announced, and the men helped each other into the bulky T-5 parachutes that would carry them safely to French soil or fail catastrophically. Each main chute had been packed by riggers whose signatures on the packing slip constituted a sacred promise of quality. "Reserve chute on your chest," Cooper reminded them. "If your main fails, you'll need to act fast." Miller felt the weight building with each additional piece of equipment. The physical burden was substantial, but it also provided a strange comfort. Everything he needed to survive would go with him into the darkness. The M1 Garand rifles were attached last, secured to the body by jump cords that would prevent loss during the drop, but allow quick access upon landing. The weight now approached 100 pounds, more than half what many of the men themselves weighed. "Christ, I can barely stand up," Simmons muttered, adjusting his stance to accommodate the load. "You won't be standing for long," Cooper replied practically. "Once we're in the plane, you'll be seated until the drop." The fully equipped men moved awkwardly, encumbered by their gear, but understanding its necessity. Every pound represented potential survival, from the ammunition that would hold off enemies to the rations that would sustain them until reinforcements arrived. Lieutenant Wilson walked the length of the barracks, inspecting his men. "Check your buddy one more time," he ordered. "Look for loose straps, unsecured equipment, anything that could compromise the jump." Miller and Martinez performed their final inspection of each other, tugging on straps and pouches to ensure everything was secure. The dog tags remained hidden beneath layers of equipment, but their presence against Miller's chest was a constant reminder of the dual purpose they served: identification for the living, accounting for the dead. "Ready?" Martinez asked quietly when they had finished. Miller nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. The weight of the equipment, the hidden dog tags, the darkened face, all combined to transform him into something other than himself, a component in a vast military machine now grinding inexorably toward its purpose. "Transport in 15 minutes, Lieutenant Wilson announced. "Final equipment check now. Nothing loose, nothing missing." As the men made their last preparations, the dog tags rested against their chests, small metal reminders of their individual identities beneath the uniform appearance of fully equipped paratroopers. Names and numbers that connected them to the lives they had lived before this night, and might, with luck and skill, return to when it was over. The operation order, 5 pages of typed instructions and maps, represented months of planning, intelligence gathering, and strategic decision-making. Colonel Braddock held it carefully as he faced the assembled paratroopers, its classified contents already committed to memory by the officers who would lead the mission. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly area where hundreds of fully equipped men stood at attention. "Tonight, you will participate in the greatest military operation ever attempted in the history of warfare." The evening air was still, allowing his words to reach every soldier. Behind him, a large map of the Normandy coastline was displayed, key objectives marked in red. Operation Neptune, the airborne component of Operation Overlord, begins with you. Before a single infantry soldier sets foot on the beaches of Normandy, you will be on the ground behind enemy lines, securing key objectives and preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Private Miller stood rigidly despite the weight of his equipment, absorbing the colonel's words. Beside him, Sergeant Davis maintained perfect posture, the embodiment of military discipline at this crucial moment. "Your specific objectives have been briefed to your platoon leaders," Braddock continued, gesturing to the operation order in his hand. "Every bridge, every causeway, every crossroad you secure saves the lives of men who will land on Utah Beach at dawn." Lieutenant Wilson felt the weight of responsibility as the colonel's gaze passed over the officers. The operation order contained the details his platoon's mission: secure and hold the Lafayette Causeway until relieved by forces moving inland from Utah Beach. Intelligence indicates approximately 6,000 German troops in your drop zones, primarily from the 91st Air Landing Division and elements of the 709th Static Infantry Division. They are well-equipped, well-trained, and dug in. The colonel's blunt assessment of the opposition caused no visible reaction among the men. They had trained for this moment for months. Their faces now darkened with combat paint, their identities subsumed into the greater purpose of the mission. You may be scattered during the drop. You may find yourself alone or with men from different units. Your standing orders remain the same. Gather what forces you can and move to your objectives. Every crossroad, every bridge is vital. Braddock paused, surveying the faces before him. I won't lie to you, some of you standing here now won't return. But each man who falls will do so knowing they contributed to the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi tyranny. The operation order in his hand seemed to take on greater significance, the physical manifestation of the mission that would cost some of these men their lives. Tonight, you jump into history, Braddock continued, his voice lowering slightly, becoming more personal. Months from now, years from now, people will remember this night as the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany. Private Simmons shifted slightly beneath his radio equipment, the weight becoming more noticeable with each passing minute. Yet the colonel's words provided a different kind of weight, purpose, and meaning for the danger that awaited them. This operation has been planned to the smallest detail, Braddock assured them, briefly consulting the document in his hand. Every contingency considered, every resource allocated. The combined might of the Allied forces stands behind you. Technical Sergeant Cooper's eyes remained fixed on the map behind the colonel, mentally tracing the routes they would need to take from their drop zones to their objectives. His practical mind was already working through problems, solutions, alternatives. Remember your training, Braddock emphasized. It will keep you alive. Remember your objectives. They will keep the men on the beaches alive. Remember what we're fighting for. It will give you strength when nothing else remains. The operation order was returned to its waterproof case as Braddock prepared to conclude his address. General Eisenhower has a message for all troops participating in the invasion, soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. The borrowed words carried additional weight coming at this final moment, before deployment. Lieutenant Wilson noted how the men seemed to stand even straighter, despite fatigue and the burden of their equipment. The eyes of the world are upon you, Braddock finished. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. Good luck, and may God be with each of you. A moment of profound silence followed the conclusion of his speech. No cheers, no dramatic responses, just the quiet determination of men who understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Captain Reynolds stepped forward to offer a final prayer, but Miller found his thoughts already elsewhere, on dark fields in France, on the faces of his family back in Nebraska, on the chocolate bar in his pocket that represented hope for survival. The assembled men were dismissed to their transport vehicles by company and platoon. Lieutenant Wilson gathered his men with a simple gesture, their movements now purposeful and focused. He didn't sugarcoat it, Davis remarked quietly to Wilson as they prepared to board. No need, Wilson replied. They're ready. The operation order was secured in the colonel's briefcase, its contents now transformed into action as hundreds of men moved toward waiting trucks. The document that had guided months of planning would remain behind, but its purpose would travel with these men into the darkness over Normandy, a blueprint for liberation beginning with a dangerous leap into history. The silver flask gleamed dully in the fading light as Private Williams extracted it from his boot, carefully unscrewing the cap. The contraband whiskey inside, against regulations but tolerated by most officers before combat, caught the last rays of sunset as he offered it first to Cooper. Dutch courage, Williams said quietly. My old man carried this same flask through the Argonne forest in 18. Cooper, normally a stickler for regulations, accepted the flask without comment and took a small sip before passing it to Martinez. The ritual continued around their small circle, Martinez to Simmons, Simmons to Miller, each man taking a modest drink before passing it on. The paratroopers had broken into small groups after the colonel's speech, seeking brief moments of companionship before the transports arrived. Lieutenant Wilson allowed this temporary relaxation of discipline, understanding the men's need to process what lay ahead in their own ways. "To making it back," Davis said when the flask reached him, raising it slightly before drinking and passing it to Williams to complete the circle. No one responded with the usual bravado or jokes. The colonel's frank acknowledgement that some wouldn't return had stripped away any pretense. Instead, they sat in companionable silence, sharing the warmth of the whiskey and the comfort of each other's presence. Nearby, other groups engaged in their own private rituals. 4 men played a quick hand of poker with a worn deck of cards. 2 soldiers from another platoon arm wrestled, the physical competition providing momentary distraction. A trio of replacements who had joined the unit just weeks earlier huddled together, their nervousness palpable despite efforts to conceal it. Lieutenant Wilson moved between these groups, offering a word here, a nod there, present but allowing the men their space. He found Davis sitting slightly apart from the others, staring at the photograph of his wife and daughters. "They'll be proud," Wilson said simply, sitting beside his sergeant. Davis nodded, carefully returning the photo to his breast pocket. "Ellen always said she married a hardware store manager, not a soldier. You're still the same man." "Am I?" Davis looked at his hands, darkened with combat paint like his face. "Sometimes I'm not sure I'll remember how to sell nails and hammers when this is over." The conversation was interrupted as Williams approached, discreetly offering the flask to Lieutenant Wilson. Against character, Wilson accepted it and took a small drink before returning it. "Just don't let Colonel Braddock see that," he cautioned with the hint of a smile. Across the assembly area, Miller sat with Simmons, both men unusually quiet. The radio operator was mechanically checking his equipment for the dozenth time, his nervous energy finding outlet in repeated inspections. "My sister Ruth got engaged last month," Miller said suddenly. "Fella who took over the Johnson farm next to ours. I haven't even met him yet." Simmons nodded understanding. "My girl's working at the telephone exchange now. Says she connects calls to generals and admirals sometimes." He paused. "Funny the things you think about now." Doc Winters moved among the groups, offering aspirin and words of reassurance. Though not jumping with their platoon, he had become a stabilizing presence during training. "Stay hydrated," he reminded each man, "and change your socks as soon as you can after landing. Trench foot will take you out of the fight faster than a bullet." Technical Sergeant Cooper had drifted away from the group, sharing Williams's flask, preferring solitude as he methodically disassembled and cleaned his knife one final time. His ritual was private, focused, almost meditative in its precision. Martinez found himself drawn to Cooper's quiet competence, silently watching the methodical work. "My grandfather had a knife like that," he offered after several minutes. "Used it for everything from skinning deer to carving toys." Cooper nodded without looking up. "My father gave me my first knife when I was 8. Said a man should always have a good blade." It was more than he usually shared about himself. As twilight deepened toward darkness, Lieutenant Wilson checked his watch. 20 minutes until they would board the transports to the airfield. He allowed himself a rare moment of doubt, quickly suppressed. Private Williams secured his flask back in his boot. The brief communion it had facilitated now concluded. The whiskey had provided not intoxication, but connection. A final shared experience before they scattered into the night sky over France. "Time to form up," Davis called, recognizing the approaching deadline without needing to check his watch. The scattered groups began to coalesce into organized units, personal moments giving way to military precision. Conversations ended mid-sentence, cards were tucked away, and photographs received final glances before being secured. Miller found Martinez adjusting his equipment one last time. "See you on the ground," he said, extending his hand. Martinez took it firmly. "First round's on me when we reach Paris." The promise hung between them, part hope, part determination, part prayer. Similar exchanges occurred throughout the assembly area as men made private promises and pacts with each other. Lieutenant Wilson gathered his platoon with a gesture. The brief respite was over. The mission timeline resumed its inexorable progression. The flask, the photographs, the playing cards, the quiet conversations, all were tucked away as the business of war reclaimed primacy. Yet something remained from these private moments, invisible but tangible, not just Dutch courage from Williams's flask, but the deeper courage that comes from knowing you don't stand alone. Whatever waited across the channel, they would face it together. The wooden bench inside the transport truck bore layers of carved graffiti, names, dates, unit designations, and crude jokes etched by countless soldiers who had traveled this route before. Private Miller's fingers traced one particular carking, Johnny R., 82nd, Sicily bound, July 4. He wondered briefly about Johnny R. If he had made it back from Sicily, if his fingers had nervously traced someone else's carving, just as Miller's did now. "Making your mark?" Sergeant Davis asked, noticing Miller's fascination with the bench graffiti. Miller shook his head. "Just reading. Lot of history here." "Let's hope we're not history by this time tomorrow," Williams quipped, earning a sharp look from Davis. The convoy of trucks rumbled through the darkening English countryside, carrying the paratroopers toward the airfields where C-47 aircraft waited. Inside each vehicle, men sat in muted contemplation, the weight of their equipment matched by the weight of the moment. Lieutenant Wilson braced himself against the truck's movement, his mind already at the drop zone. The vehicle hit a pothole, jolting everyone, causing equipment to rattle. No one complained. "See that?" Martinez pointed through a gap in the truck's canvas covering. A group of British civilians had gathered along the road, some waving, others simply watching the passing military convoy. "They know," Cooper said quietly. "Whole damn country knows something big is coming." The civilians represented the last glimpse of normal life before the paratroopers entered the closed military world of the airfield. The final transition point before France. Some men waved back, others simply stared, committing the scene to memory. As the truck rounded a bend, Miller's attention returned to the graffiti. Names and units from months of operations, North Africa, Sicily, Italy. The wooden benches had carried men to embarkation points for every major operation, each soldier leaving some small mark of their passage. Simmons, the radio operator, had been unusually quiet throughout the journey, the extra weight of his communication equipment making the truck ride particularly uncomfortable. "You all right?" Miller asked. Simmons nodded. "Just thinking about my replacement at Western Union. Wonder if he's as good at Morse code as I was." The mundane concern seemed strangely touching. A connection to normal life when everything around them pointed toward the extraordinary nature of their immediate future. The truck slowed as it approached a checkpoint. Military police examined papers, waved them through. Security tightened with each mile closer to the airfield, the operation's secrecy paramount, despite the obvious scale of activity. "Almost there," Davis announced unnecessarily as the truck's engine changed pitch for a climb. Lieutenant Wilson felt the change in his men as they neared their destination, a subtle straightening of postures, refocusing of attention, the informal conversation of the journey giving way to professional focus. Through gaps in the canvas, glimpses of other vehicles appeared. Trucks like theirs carrying men, jeeps with officers, ambulances positioned with grim expectation of future need. The entire countryside seemed transformed into an armed camp oriented toward one purpose. The truck hit another pothole, harder this time. Equipment rattled, men steadied themselves against each other. Cooper checked his weapon by reflex, ensuring the rough ride hadn't compromised any crucial gear. They couldn't find smoother roads for the invasion of Europe, Williams muttered, adjusting his position on the bench. "Probably saving the smooth ones for the generals," Martinez replied, provoking brief laughter that relieved tension momentarily. The carved graffiti on the bench caught Miller's attention again. Beyond names and units, some soldiers had left brief messages. "Give 'em hell, Berlin by Christmas." For Jimmy, vengeance. Each carving represented a man's thoughts before combat, preserved in wood to be read by those who followed. The truck slowed again, this time more definitively. Orders were shouted outside, engines revved and died. They had arrived at the airfield perimeter. "Prepare to disembark," Lieutenant Wilson announced, his voice steady and professional. "Equipment check as you exit. Form up by platoon outside." The moment of transition had arrived. From passengers to paratroopers, from men in transit to men with immediate purpose. Equipment was adjusted, weapons secured, last-minute checks performed with practiced efficiency. As the truck came to a complete stop and the tailgate lowered, Miller impulsively pulled out his jump knife and quickly scratched "M. 101st Normandy, June 44, into the wooden bench. Not his full name. Security regulations forbade that, but enough that some future soldier might wonder about him, just as he had wondered about Johnny R. from Sicily. Davis noticed but said nothing, understanding the impulse. He had seen the same ritual performed before other jumps, other operations. The human need to leave some mark, some proof of passage, was as old as war itself. The paratroopers disembarked in orderly fashion despite their bulky equipment. As his boots hit the ground, Miller looked back briefly at the truck that had carried them. One more transition point now behind them. Ahead, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the silhouettes of C-47 aircraft waited on the tarmac. Great aluminum birds that would carry them across the channel. The sight provoked no comments. Nothing needed to be said. Lieutenant Wilson gathered his platoon with a gesture. "Move out," he ordered simply, and the men marched toward their designated aircraft, leaving the trucks and their carved memories behind. The nose art on the C-47 aircraft depicted a voluptuous redhead riding a falling bomb, with Miss Liberty painted in bold letters beneath the provocative image. Private Miller stared at the artwork as he approached the plane that would carry him into combat, struck by the incongruity of such a playful, almost innocent representation adorning an instrument of war. "The crew chief painted her," explained the pilot, a lieutenant barely older than Miller himself, who stood near the aircraft's door greeting each paratrooper as they prepared to board. "Says she's brought us luck on 13 missions so far." "Let's hope for 14, Sergeant Davis replied, eyeing the artwork with professional detachment before turning his attention to more practical matters. The airfield bustled with activity as hundreds of C-47 transport planes, the workhorse aircraft of the Allied Air Forces, were prepared for the night's mission. Each plane would carry a stick of paratroopers across the English Channel and drop them into occupied France under cover of darkness. Lieutenant Wilson consulted briefly with the pilot, reviewing drop zone coordinates and recognition signals. The two officers spoke with the clipped efficiency of men for whom time had become a critical resource. "Weather report?" Wilson asked. "Scattered clouds over the channel, possible ground fog at the drop zone," the pilot replied. "Nothing we can't handle." The loading process followed established protocol. With paratroopers boarding in reverse order of their jump sequence, last man out would be first man in. Each soldier struggled up the narrow steps, encumbered by nearly 100 pounds of equipment. "Watch your chute on the doorframe," warned the crew chief, a sergeant whose casual confidence with the aircraft contrasted with the paratroopers' obvious tension. Inside, the C-47's Spartan interior offered minimal comfort, aluminum benches along each side of the fuselage, exposed ribs and spars overhead, and a bare floor channel running down the center. No insulation, no amenities, nothing to distract from its purely functional purpose. Miller found his assigned seat, carefully maneuvering to avoid snagging his parachute or equipment on the various protrusions inside the aircraft. Martinez settled beside him, their shoulders touching due to the narrow confines. "Cozy," Martinez commented, attempting humor despite the discomfort. As each man boarded, the aircraft settled lower on its landing gear, the combined weight of 20 fully equipped paratroopers testing its capacity. The interior gradually filled, bench by bench, until all seats were occupied and the door was secured. Technical Sergeant Cooper studied the aircraft's construction with professional interest, noting the rivets, control cables, and structural elements visible throughout the unfinished interior. His mechanical mind automatically assessed strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. "Ever flown before?" Miller asked Simmons, who sat across from him clutching his radio equipment. "Once. County fair back home had a barnstormer offering 5-minute rides for $1. Simmons replied. "Nothing like this." The C-47, designed as a cargo aircraft and hastily adapted for parachute operations, made no concessions to passenger comfort. The engine noise would be deafening once started. The vibration constant, the temperature governed only by altitude and outside conditions. Lieutenant Wilson was the last to board, taking his position nearest the door where he would be first to jump, leading his men in action as he had in training. His face betrayed no emotion as he settled into place, checking his equipment one final time. The luminous dial of Lieutenant Wilson's wristwatch read 21:17 hours, 43 minutes since takeoff. 73 minutes until the scheduled drop. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously as the C-47 droned through the darkness over the English Channel. The watch had been a graduation gift from his father, a sturdy military-issue timepiece with radium-painted numerals that glowed faintly green in the dimly lit aircraft. 1 hour, 10 minutes to drop zone, Wilson announced, raising his voice above the engine noise. The information rippled through the cabin, acknowledged with nods or small adjustments of equipment. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. 20 fully equipped paratroopers crammed into the Spartan interior of the transport aircraft, unable to stand or stretch, each man alone with his thoughts despite the physical proximity to others. Private Miller shifted uncomfortably on the hard bench, his legs beginning to cramp from the awkward position. The weight of his equipment, manageable when standing or moving, became an increasing burden during the prolonged stillness of the flight. "Time check," Martinez asked. Unable to see his own watch beneath layers of equipment. 22:19, Miller replied after checking his timepiece, adding unnecessarily, 71 minutes to go. Sergeant Davis monitored his men's conditions, noting signs of air sickness or excessive anxiety. The physical discomfort was universal and expected. The psychological pressure varied among individuals. His own watch received frequent glances, an unconscious habit that marked the countdown to action. Outside, darkness enveloped the aircraft. Occasional breaks in the cloud cover revealed glimpses of moonlight on water below. The English Channel, which they were now crossing. No lights were visible from the formation. Every aircraft flew in complete blackout to avoid detection. Lieutenant Wilson used his watch to track their progress against the mission timetable. The invasion's complex choreography required precise timing. Their drop needed to occur exactly as planned to secure objectives before the beach landings began at dawn. "Halfway point," the crew chief announced at 20:30, causing another collective check of watches. The psychological milestone offered small relief. Halfway there, but still 40 minutes of cramped anticipation before the action began. Technical Sergeant Cooper had positioned himself where he could see the aircraft's structural elements, monitoring the vibrations and sounds of the C-47 with his mechanic's sensitivity. His watch received only occasional glances. He measured their journey in mechanical performance rather than minutes. Private Simmons fought waves of nausea, the aircraft's motion, and his own anxiety combining to challenge his stomach's stability. His watch became a focus point, something concrete to concentrate on besides his discomfort. Just 67 more minutes to endure. The C-47 hit an air pocket, dropping suddenly before recovering. Equipment rattled, men tensed, and several groans escaped involuntarily. No one spoke of the danger, not just the jump ahead, but the flight itself. Anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, navigation errors, multiple threats existed before they even reached the drop zone. 202:35, Davis noted aloud. "Equipment check." The order provided welcome activity as men inspected their gear, yet again, checking buckles, straps, and crucial items. The routine task offered momentary distraction from both physical discomfort and mental tension. Lieutenant Wilson consulted his map, comparing their plotted course with the estimated time remaining. The watch on his wrist ticked relentlessly forward, 2037, 2038, 2039, each minute bringing them closer to the moment when the relative safety of the aircraft would give way to the absolute vulnerability of the drop. Miller closed his eyes briefly, trying to alleviate the strain of constant vigilance. The darkness behind his eyelids offered no escape. Images of training jumps, briefings, and imagined combat scenarios played across his mind. When he opened his eyes again, his watch showed only 2 minutes had passed. The aircraft entered a bank of clouds, the windows showing nothing but occasional flickers of lightning in the distance. The summer weather over the channel was unpredictable, adding another variable to the already complex operation. Weather report just came in, the crew chief shouted after a brief conversation with the cockpit. Scattered clouds over the drop zone, visibility fair to good. The information provided small comfort. Fair visibility meant they should be able to identify their drop zone, but it also meant German gunners would have better conditions to target the vulnerable aircraft and descending paratroopers. 30 minutes, Wilson announced at 2050, and tension visibly increased throughout the cabin. The abstract concept of the mission was transforming into imminent reality with each tick of their watches. Sergeant Davis began checking static lines again, a precautionary measure that allowed for activity rather than passive waiting. The critical cords that would deploy their parachutes received intense scrutiny, though they had been checked multiple times already. Private Williams broke the growing tension briefly. "Anyone else need to piss as bad as I do?" The comment elicited muted laughter, a momentary release of pressure, as men acknowledged the shared discomfort of basic bodily functions complicated by equipment and circumstance. Outside, the formation of aircraft continued its carefully plotted course toward Normandy. Inside each plane, similar scenes unfolded, men watching the slow advance of time on their watches, equipment checked repeatedly, discomfort endured stoically. Lieutenant Wilson allowed himself a rare personal moment, briefly touching the breast pocket where his father's compass resided alongside a photograph of his family. Then his eyes returned to his watch, 24 minutes remaining. The waiting continued, punctuated only by occasional announcements, position changes to alleviate discomfort, and the constant drone of engines that had transformed from intrusive noise to almost unnoticed background. Minutes stretched like hours, yet paradoxically the time remaining diminished with alarming speed. The wooden rosary beads moved rhythmically through Corporal Martinez's fingers as the C-47's engines roared to full power, the aircraft straining against its brakes at the head of the runway. The small crucifix caught the dim cabin light as Martinez whispered prayers in Spanish, his lips moving almost imperceptibly, his eyes closed in concentrated devotion. Private Miller noticed the ritual, but said nothing, respecting his friend's moment of spiritual preparation. Around them, the other paratroopers responded to the imminent takeoff in their own ways, some with tense silence, others with forced bravado, all feeling the physical sensations of the aircraft preparing to lift into the night sky. "Here we go," Sergeant Davis announced unnecessarily as the brakes released, and the C-47 lurched forward, beginning its takeoff roll with increasing speed. The runway lights streaked past the small windows, briefly illuminating portions of the cabin before disappearing behind them. The aircraft vibrated intensely, metal frame protesting against the stress of full power and heavy load. Lieutenant Wilson braced himself against the movement, maintaining his composed demeanor despite the chaotic sensation. His eyes briefly caught the sight of Martinez with his rosary, before turning to the cabin at large, assessing his men's reactions to this first critical phase of their journey. Martinez continued his prayers, the familiar ritual providing comfort amidst the mechanical violence of the takeoff. The rosary had been his mother's gift when he enlisted, blessed by their parish priest in New Mexico. The simple wooden beads connected him to home, to faith, to something beyond the immediate danger. The C-47's tail lifted, then the entire aircraft left the ground, stomach dropping momentarily before stabilizing into a steep climb. Several men instinctively grabbed at handholds, their bodies registering the sudden transition from earth to sky. Through the windows, the airfield rapidly fell away below, its perimeter lights forming a distinct rectangle that quickly diminished as they gained altitude. Beyond, the darkened English countryside spread in all directions, with only occasional pinpricks of light visible through the strict blackout conditions. "Clear," the crew chief announced, signaling that they had successfully taken off and were proceeding with the mission. The single word carried significant weight: no mechanical failures, no aborted takeoff, no return to base. They were committed now. Martinez completed his decade of Hail Marys and tucked the rosary securely into a pocket where it wouldn't tangle with his equipment. The prayer complete, his focus returned to the practical realities of their situation. The climb continued, engines straining against gravity and payload. Each man felt the pressure changes in his ears, some swallowing repeatedly to equalize, others yawning to achieve the same effect. The aircraft banked slightly, joining the formation pattern with other C-47s rising from nearby airfields. Outside, glimpses of other aircraft could occasionally be seen. Dark silhouettes against slightly less dark sky, navigation lights extinguished for security. The massive aerial armada was assembling, hundreds of aircraft carrying thousands of paratroopers, all converging on designated routes toward Normandy. The cabin temperature dropped noticeably as they gained altitude, the unangulated aircraft offering little protection against the chill of higher elevations. Men adjusted equipment, secured loose items, and settled in for the journey, the initial drama of takeoff giving way to the prolonged reality of the flight. Course heading 180, the crew chief informed Lieutenant Wilson, indicating their initial southward direction over the English Channel. "Will maintain 1,500 feet for the crossing, then drop to 600 feet, approaching the coast." The information matched their briefing expectations. Wilson checked his watch, calculating their progress against the mission timetable. So far, exactly on schedule. Martinez touched the pocket containing his rosary, drawing continued comfort from its presence. Around him, other men engaged in their own personal rituals or distraction techniques. Williams repeatedly checked his gear. Simmons focused intently on controlling his breathing. Cooper observed the aircraft's mechanical functions with professional interest. Private Miller discovered that his fear had transformed into something else during takeoff: a heightened awareness, a strange clarity. The scholarly part of his mind noted how ancient warriors must have felt similar sensations before battle, the body preparing for extreme circumstances by sharpening perceptions and focusing attention. Sergeant Davis moved carefully through the cabin, checking on each man without disturbing the established seating arrangement. A nod here, a brief word there, small leadership gestures that maintained connection and conveyed confidence. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the engine note changing slightly as power adjusted for level flight. The vibration settled into a consistent rhythm that gradually became background sensation rather than immediate distraction. "Channel crossing beginning," the crew chief announced approximately 10 minutes after takeoff. No land was visible through the windows now, only darkness below where they knew water stretched between England and occupied France. Martinez whispered a final prayer and straightened in his seat, transitioning fully from spiritual preparation to combat readiness. The rosary remained in his pocket, its purpose fulfilled for now, though he knew many men returned to prayer when parachutes deployed, and the true vulnerability of their position became apparent. Lieutenant Wilson signaled Davis to begin another equipment check, providing purposeful activity during the channel crossing. The familiar routine helped maintain focus and prevented excessive introspection during this liminal phase of their journey. The Normandy coast remained hours away, the actual jump even further, yet psychologically the mission had definitively begun with wheels leaving English soil. The aircraft droned southward, one among hundreds carrying the vanguard of the Allied invasion force. Inside, 20 men experienced the same physical circumstances with 20 different internal realities, each processing fear, anticipation, doubt, and determination according to his own nature. Martinez's rosary beads symbolized just one approach to facing the momentous events unfolding with each kilometer of their flight path. The red jump light glowed ominously near the aircraft's door, its crimson warning holding 20 men in suspended animation. Everything, months of training, weeks of preparation, hours of flight, condensed to this singular moment, waiting for that light to change from red to green. 20 minutes to drop zone, the crew chief shouted above the engine noise, prompting Lieutenant Wilson to initiate the final sequence. "Stand up," Wilson ordered, and 20 men rose awkwardly in the narrow confines of the C-47, the weight of their equipment making even this simple movement challenging. "Hook up," came the next command. Each paratrooper took his static line and connected its metal clip to the overhead epaulet, running the length of the aircraft. The clicks of 20 snap hooks engaging provided audible confirmation of this critical step. Private Miller, positioned last in the stick as the most junior man, secured his static line and then stared at the red light. That small illuminated circle represented the boundary between preparation and action, between relative safety and absolute vulnerability. "Equipment check," Wilson continued, and each man examined the equipment of the soldier in front of him, checking for loose straps, unsecured items, or problems with the parachute pack. Hands moved methodically down backs and sides, ensuring everything was properly configured for the jump. "Sound off for equipment check," Wilson called, initiating the verbal confirmation sequence. 20 OK, Miller shouted, having checked the 19th man's equipment. 19 OK, came the next response. And so the count continued forward toward the door, each number confirming readiness, each voice containing its own particular mixture of tension and determination. Outside, the first flickers of anti-aircraft fire became visible in the distance, deadly fireworks rising from German positions that had detected the approaching armada. Occasional flashes illuminated the cabin interior, casting strange shadows across painted faces. The aircraft suddenly lurched as the pilot took evasive action, causing several men to stumble against each other before regaining balance. No one spoke. The increase in enemy activity needed no commentary. 10 minutes, the crew chief announced, moving to the door in preparation for opening it when they reached the designated point. The red jump light continued its silent vigil, unwavering despite the increasingly chaotic circumstances outside. More anti-aircraft fire rose from the darkened landscape below, some explosions occurring uncomfortably close to their flight path. Lieutenant Wilson's face revealed nothing but calm focus as he prepared to lead his men into combat. His hand moved briefly to his chest pocket, where the compass from his father rested, one generation's war token carried into another's battle. "Stand in the door," Wilson ordered, when the crew chief signaled the 5-minute mark. He positioned himself in the open doorway, one hand gripping the edge of the aircraft, the other holding his static line, body leaning slightly into the violent wind that tore at his uniform and equipment. The night sky outside revealed glimpses of the larger operation, other C-47s visible briefly, their silhouettes illuminated by distant explosions, some already trailing streams of descending paratroopers marked by muzzle flashes rising to meet them. Sergeant Davis positioned himself behind Wilson, ready to follow his lieutenant into the void and then gather whatever men he could find on the ground. His expression remained impassive, professional, focused entirely on the immediate task. The approaching drop zone was partially obscured by clouds, occasional breaks revealing the patchwork landscape of Normandy below. Fields, hedgerows, roads, and scattered buildings, some areas unnaturally shiny where German flooding had created obstacles for the very operation now unfolding. 1 minute, the crew chief shouted, his voice nearly lost in the combined roar of engines, wind, and distant explosions. The red jump light commanded every man's attention now, 20 pairs of eyes fixed on the small circle that would soon transform from prohibition to command. The tension in the aircraft became almost tangible, muscles tightening, breathing controlled but shallow, minds narrowed to the singular focus of what would happen next. Miller felt his heart pounding against his chest, the sound seeming to fill his ears despite the external cacophony. His mouth went dry, his palms damp within his gloves. The equipment that had felt so heavy during the flight now seemed to weigh nothing, his body charged with adrenaline that negated physical sensation. An explosion flashed uncomfortably close to their aircraft, the concussion rocking them momentarily. Someone muttered a curse, quickly suppressed. The red light remained unchanged, impassive in the face of the chaos erupting around them. Lieutenant Wilson maintained his position in the door, body tense and ready, eyes alternating between the jump light and glimpses of the terrain below during breaks in the cloud cover. His responsibility extended beyond his own jump to ensuring every man in his stick followed him out the door. 30 seconds came the final warning from the crew chief, who now stood positioned to monitor the exits and ensure no static lines became tangled. The aircraft dropped suddenly, either from turbulence or pilot adjustment to reach the correct altitude for the drop. Several men grunted as the floor seemed to fall away momentarily beneath their feet before stabilizing again. Miller found himself unconsciously touching the breast pocket containing his family photograph, then the opposite pocket with the New Testament. Like his comrades, he had his talismans, his connections to something beyond this moment of extreme transition. The red jump light continued its vigil, seconds stretching to perceived eternity as 20 men stood poised between aircraft and emptiness, between England and France, between preparation and combat. Then it happened. The red glow extinguished and replaced by brilliant green. The transformation was instantaneous and definitive. "No, go, go, go," Wilson shouted, though the command was almost unnecessary. The green light itself was the true imperative, releasing them from waiting into action. Lieutenant Wilson disappeared through the door without hesitation, static line trailing behind him. Sergeant Davis followed immediately. Then Cooper, Martinez, Williams, each man shuffling forward in the choreographed sequence they had practiced countless times. Miller moved with the line, watching each man ahead disappear through the door, the stick diminishing pair by pair, until suddenly he stood at the threshold himself, the crew chief nodding sharply, the green light glowing with unmistakable command. One step and he was falling, the static line pulling taut behind him, the aircraft already vanishing above, the night air rushing past as gravity claimed him. One more paratrooper descending into history, into darkness, into the momentous events